Tonight, we won't stand before golden thrones or recite hymns to the sun. Instead, we'll step quietly into a smaller chamber, a hall of limestone and lamplight where balance, not power, ruled the air. Here, justice isn't shouted, it's weighed. A feather rests beside a scale, lighter than breath, older than any crown. Scribes murmur over clay tablets, their words slow enough to sound like patience made audible. Somewhere nearby, the Nile turns in its sleep, its rhythm steady as a heartbeat that never learned to hurry. You can almost feel the hush of the place, the scent of ink, the dry whisper of papyrus, the stillness that comes from believing the universe prefers precision. Each rule is small, almost tender a way to remind the world not to tip too far in any direction. So lower the lights and let the cool air of the hall gather around you. If the quiet feels balanced tonight, stay for a while. And if old orders like this one steady your breathing, that's already enough to belong here. And somewhere beyond the lamplight, a judge adjusts the smallest of weights. A feather against a handful of barley, truth against convenience. It's not a trial, not really. It's a rehearsal for the world staying in tune. Every scale here hums with memory. Of markets that opened only when balance was confirmed, of scribes who swore to weigh with a true weight, and of rulers who learned that names written carelessly could unmake a kingdom. Because in Egypt, order was not a wish, it was a verb. And every feather, every ink stroke, every measured gesture began with a single idea, that even the gods respected good handwriting. In the low light of a limestone hall, a judge adjusts a tiny scale, and everyone suddenly agrees on the price of onions. The feather beside him belongs to ma'at balance, truth, and the quiet discipline of things behaving as they should. It rests there not as decoration, but as structure, the way a spirit level makes a loan shelf honest. Scribes murmur the same vow they have murmured for centuries, to weigh with a true weight. Ink gathers in small pools of patience, and the air itself seems to slow until thought and breath share the same tempo. A steward lifts one red pen. The market opens. Baskets of barley wait in perfect stillness, the scales hold steady, and the morning begins to move again. Because here, balance is not an idea, it is a way of breathing. A day in this city sounds like rushes rustling and sandals whispering code. Before coinage is common, numbers are bread and beer, and if the numbers drift, so do rations and tempers. So the reed pens draw numbers that are also loaves, and jars that are also paychecks. And behind this quiet bureaucracy is a very practical superstition. If the feather says level, the scales must agree. It looks ceremonial because the most useful things often do. When a granary door rattles, the clerk straightens a pan weight with the same care you use to nudge a crooked picture frame while pretending you aren't the sort of person who notices. The pan steadies and a contract steadies, and someone downriver can plant the field knowing the barley he's paid later will be a size he can recognize with his eyes closed. Truth turns out to be comfortable. It keeps floods from becoming famines and quarrels from becoming lawsuits. It is the sound policy of a civilization that loves surfaces polished like reasons. Names are given the same respect. To write the king's name incorrectly is not just a spelling mistake. It is a small crime against the king's afterlife and the archive's sanity. So the rule says the royal name lives inside an oval, what we call a cartouche, and must be written completely in a particular order with steady hands. The cartouche looks romantic on a pendant, but in the scribal office it works like a barcode. It isolates the name from surrounding chatter, it makes every clerk's record searchable by the future, and it prevents mischief. Scratching a name away is treated like denying a person's passport and their memory in one scrape, so the law defends even the ink. This fussy protection is how tax lists connect to royal decrees without becoming a game of, is this the same Ramesses as that Ramesses? The cartouche does many jobs at once: halo and handcuff, brand and paperclip. If you've ever labeled your jars of spices and felt superior to chaos for about 4 minutes, you already understand the psychology. A city adopts these little ovals and little feathers the way a household adopts hooks behind a door. Things hang straight and are easier to find. Contracts quote the feather, and letters tuck a miniature oval around a superior's name to avoid accidental disrespect. There is something adorable about it, like putting a crown on a cat in a drawing, and something very efficient about it, like labeling that drawing cat. Domestic, male, page 3. A civilization that writes on stone learns quickly that a line rules for a very long time. So rules become careful, even in their humor, and the margins of papyrus look like a whispering library of deadlines. On a hot afternoon, a clerk smooths a wrinkle with his palm, looks north through the doorway to orient himself, and writes a name again, perfectly. The oval is not magic, but it keeps the world from smudging. If you drift to the temples, the rules become fabric and water. Priests shave their heads and bodies not to look dramatic, but because desert lice are democratic. Hair is a kind of portable habitat, and the gods prefer offerings that have not lived under a small personal ecosystem. So the rule is daily bathing and linen instead of leather. Linen breathes, it washes without sulking, and it doesn't keep yesterday's smell as a souvenir. Imagine a bakery that is also a sanctuary, and consider the power of not carrying crumbs in your sleeves. The same rule that keeps offerings ritually pure also keeps storerooms hygienic and kitchens sensible. People who work around sacred bread and sacred beer move through the day in fabrics that sigh rather than squeak. They are cooler, cleaner, and probably less itchy. The gods, who are practical behind all that gold leaf, get better service. Food rules are not a single sermon, they are a map. In one gnome, temple workers avoid certain fish. In another, pork sits on the don't bother shelf, and the pattern makes sense the way a river does. Locally, then seasonally, then all at once. During warm months when canals are low and fish are more like roommates than strangers, abstaining keeps stomachs calm. At planting time, when pigs root in fields at night and the cold snap has not properly cleaned the landscape, a taboo also protects the ledger. A rule that reads like theology, do not eat, often rides into town on a public health donkey named, please don't dash get dash sick dash this dash week. The interesting part is that the rule respects locality. The priests do not export one city's best habit to another city like a pushy relative. They say here and now and mean it. It is a kind of humility hidden inside stern phrases. If you've ever changed your coffee mug because one cupboard is mysteriously damp in summer, you've practiced ancient epidemiology. Markets obey the same quiet logic. Vendors wash their hands because sacred things might be touched, and because people who wash hands sell more dates. You could call it holiness or call it customer service. A shaved priest supervising the storeroom checks seals and smiles at neatness for reasons both spiritual and obvious. We do not need to choose between them. Linen flaps on a line in the courtyard and scatters the heat like cards, and a temple worker passes beneath with a jug. From somewhere in the inner rooms, a chant softly counts, and outside, a child counts the same way while she learns to measure flour. The day is a long series of rinses. We are clean because the gods expect it, and because our neighbors visit. Work, like breakfast, is quantified. A laborer's wage is loaves and beer measured by shape and jar, so a person can recognize pay with a glance and the pleasant heft of a known vessel. There is a reason the city loves standard curves. A baker can line loaves like bricks, a foreman can stack jars tighter than gossip, and a worker can take his wage home without borrowing someone else's basket. The shapes are contracts. At Deir al-Medina, the village of tomb workers, complaints get written when delivery slips, and sometimes the men simply stop digging and start speaking in the direction of management until the jurors catch up. In a sense, the strike is polite. It merely restores the geometry of the pantry. With coins, you argue over numbers. With loaves, you argue over volume, which is easier to measure before coffee. A foreman holding the standard jar looks as calm as a librarian holding the right book. Everyone sleeps better when pay fits the hand. The cleverness is not grand, it is everyday. A narrow-necked vessel slows evaporation. A loaf with marked score lines proves size even after someone nibbles. A receipt is a potsherd with numbers on it because a shard does not blow away as quickly as paper, and because recycling is older than we think. The office shelf contains a short museum of fairness, a jar, a mold, a measuring rope, a board with grooves. It is not that people are angels. It is that the system makes cheating loud, the way pushing a stack of plates makes noise. There is comfort in knowing that your dinner is secured against the more theatrical impulses of the ambitious. And if you're wondering, yes, the beer is weak by modern standards, but plentiful by the standard that currently interests you, which is the one that includes naps. Over everything, the river lifts its shoulder and sets it down. Only officials may speak the nilometer numbers aloud because a cubit more water is a feast and a cubit less is a tax, and you do not want rumors. Adjusting your appetite before the river has finished making up its mind. The nilometer is a staircase with careful cuts. People come to listen the way commuters look at a screen, and the announcement becomes policy. How much grain to store, how many men to send to dredge, which festival to whisper to, which tax to postpone. A quiet bureaucracy sparrows around the staircase. If the reading is low, canal duty wakes up. Men with ropes and baskets unclog the veins of the fields. After the silt is lifted and the water moves, your right to ignore that particular chore resumes until next time. Civil engineering by dinner hour. There is something satisfying about the schedule. The rule to keep canals open has a second job too. It patrols mosquitoes without knowing their Latin name. Stagnant corners are not romantic in the afternoon. They are invitations. So the same men who like straight walls also like water that moves, and the harvest thanks them without needing a speech. In a low year, the city breathes thinner but steadier. In a high year, officials mutter against enthusiasm and remind everyone that grain silos are not for sudden heroics. A staircase cut into stone becomes a public mood ring with numbers. It is not dramatic. It is the opposite of dramatic, which is exactly the point. When we talk about building, the rituals look like theater until they produce geometry. And then you realize theater is one of the better ways to make people repeat a measurement the same way for centuries. There is a rite called stretching the chord, in which architects cite the stars. Pull a line taut and fix a right angle with a plumb bob. It includes a small flourish of words to remind participants that north is not a rumor, and the chord hums as if pleased to be a straightness machine. Aligning walls toward the north prevents drift over hundreds of meters, which is the sort of detail a pyramid cares about. The ceremony, repeated with fresh seriousness each time, settles team nerves. It tells everyone when to stop adjusting and how to begin again tomorrow. If you've ever used a laser level and felt a little bit holy when the dots aligned, you and an old kingdom architect would have a quiet conversation about tools. Teams step it out in cadence. Baselines are established by walking and counting and walking again. The way bread is counted, the way anything is counted when it has to last. The plumb bob's tiny bronze cone becomes an authority no one wishes to argue with, which is convenient, because arguing with a weight on a string is unproductive and does not move the quarry blocks. Piety produces geometry, geometry produces right angles, and right angles keep roofs from migrating across time. Every peg in court means fewer disputes later. A straight wall remembers. A corner prevents improvisation by the enthusiastic but misinformed. And at night the builders wash dust from their eyelashes and sleep under a sky measured by the same stars that set their baseline. The project drifts slowly towards squareness like a raft toward shore. Security is mostly language. Tomb texts promise crocodiles and divine audits for thieves, which is a polite way of announcing that the desert police live far away and cannot sprint. The curses are less a mystic explosion than a policy tool that fits on stone. By telling you that the god will personally check your accounts and find you wanting, the text makes a small spreadsheet inside your conscience. The risk-to-reward ratio grows unfriendly. The same logic appears on seals pressed into jar stoppers and doors. Break the seal, face the official frown. Keep the seal, sleep well. Exact phrases to the work of locks where metal is expensive and distance is real. The words bite in public where rumor markets thrive, and deterrence spreads quietly like shade. These warnings protect irrigation labor too. A canal that feeds a village crosses tomb lands and temple lands, and anybody tempted to borrow a stone slab remembers the crocodile paragraph and decides to be generous. Toward future travelers, interference is expensive by design. The city is often better at telling stories than at catching hands in the act, and it uses that strength. It prints the stories on the world. A farmer walking at dusk can read, in the same meter as a hymn, that taking this thing disturbs a goddess who notices and has a ledger. There are better hobbies. The result is not zero theft, but a reasonable amount of sleep in neighborhoods that cannot afford gates with hinges that squeak for the next 3 centuries. If all this sounds gentle, it is because the city has a talent for making control look like good manners. Weighing with true weights is an oath and a customer service policy. Writing the king's name correctly is a prayer and a filing system. Shaving and linen belong to purity and to pest control. Bread sizes are devotion and payroll. Nilometer numbers are festival invitations and tax memos. Cord stretching is a ceremony and a geometry lesson. Tomb curses are drama and neighborhood watch. The wisdom here is not that people were different. It is that the same mind can enjoy incense and also volume calibration. Your favorite coffee shop does something similar when it names the holiday blend like a poem, but still uses the stainless steel scoop. We could drift a little longer between rooms. In one, a black ink column lists loaves owed to a work game by day. In another, a small boy practices drawing a cartouche. His oval a little too tight, his teacher patient because tight ovals come with age. In a courtyard, a line of linen winks at the sun like fish scales while a priest runs a hand along the sealed door to feel whether the clay is dry. Down at the quay, a messenger looks up the staircase cut in the nilometer and hesitates before announcing the number, savoring the last second before the city adjusts its plans by a cubit. A mason wetting the edge of a block with a sponge listens to the plumb bob knock softly against the stone and feels calmer than reason. If you re-still with me, and it's perfectly fine if you're not, the feather continues to balance, the oval continues to hold a name steady, the river continues to read itself like a calendar, and rules that seem strange at first keep the world from tearing at the edges. It is all wonderfully, sleepily sensible. A law is a habit with a better costume. A custom is a habit with a schedule. The habits line up quietly at dawn and tick through the day until the lamps bloom and the city settles into the kind of silence that comes after many small, correct actions. We will leave the judges and their scales to the night. The pan steadies one last time. The cord hangs still. The seal dries. The water moves. The feather is not heavy, and that is exactly why it works. You might not expect a bridge to have its own beer, its own saint, and a small army of ticket counters with knives, but in the gray hush before a market day, a wooden gate creaks open, and you can hear the bureaucracy breathing. The river is the same as yesterday, but the rules are awake. A clerk warms his hands over a brazier and lays out strings of tallies cut from willow, each notch a future cart. Someone has painted the plank with a fresh line, so narrow wheels will behave and wide wheels will pay for misbehavior. A little bell hangs near the chain, modest as a teacup, and it is about to count a town into existence one hoof at a time. If you're still awake by the time we get to bridge-sponsored bake sales, you can subscribe or just think kindly of the next toll booth you meet. Both actions are equal in the eyes of sleep. Crossing was not only a matter of planks and courage, it was paperwork disguised as wood. Medieval towns granted pontage, which sounds like a sandwich, but is actually permission to collect tolls while promising to spend them on the bridge rather than on other civic temptations such as more bell ropes or a very long bench. To make the promise physical, a wax seal hung from a parchment by a long tail, the text swaying in drafts like a polite threat. The seal showed a saint or a castle or sometimes a bridge that looked nothing like the real one, but looked very accountable. At dawn, the warden set the parchment where everyone could see it, but no one could touch it. A standard ritual of public honesty, similar to keeping a cookie jar on a shelf you need a stool to reach. The legal spell worked well enough. The same river that undid carts in spring gave the town a budget in winter. For the traveler, the law arrived as choreography. First, you slowed your wagon to a walking pace so the planks would not bark. Then you listened for the keeper's questions, the kind where only two answers exist, and one of them costs more. Is the load for market or for war? For profit or for the poor? Do the wheels measure so many thumbs, or so many thumbs plus the gossip of last year's miller's ox? If you produced a token, sometimes wood, sometimes lead, sometimes a tiny passport with a saint peering down his nose, you paid less or not at all. If you failed the etiquette of produce, the scale came out, and with it the long memory of the clerk who still remembered your cousin's attempt to cross with one barrel that was rather obviously two small ones hugging in a shared sleeve. But even when you lost, you learned the rhythm. The bridge was a teacher with fees. The saint, you will be relieved to know, handled morale. Many bridges kept a small shrine halfway across, a pause where wind pushed your hat in friendly ways, and a niche collected coins along with rumors. The patron might be Saint Benezet in the south, an apprentice shepherd whose job description escalated to move stones with miracles, or Saint John of Nepomuk farther east, specializing in not falling in. Either way, the psychology was elegant. When you make a dangerous thing polite, people approach it with both caution and gratitude. If there was a statue, it faced the current the way a stern ant faces a badly behaved punch bowl. Travelers touch the pedestal the way you tap your pockets for a key you definitely have. Superstition, certainly. Also, a handrail for the mind. Tickets came with their own tiny theater. The most satisfying version was the split tally, a stick with notches for the fee, cleft lengthwise. One half stayed with you, one half lived with the keeper. Later, when records were reconciled, the halves kissed together, and if the notches matched, the numbers agreed. It is hard to counterfeit a piece of wood that broke its own way. Trees are good at unique. A traveler might keep several halves tucked in a hatband like flat feathers. If he passed often, he purchased a season pass of sorts, a line of proofs tied with cord, each proof a day where the river did not win. There were also lead tokens the size of a fingernail, stamped with bridges that looked like castles and castles that looked like biscuits. You could spend them only on crossings, which made them the original store credit for geography. Width was both physics and policy. Clerks measured carts at the hub, not the rim, because hubs are honest and rims learn tricks. A rule might say nothing wider than so many hands, not because the town hated generous carts, but because generous carts punched holes in planks the way a heavy boot remembers a thin winter. To encourage good manners, tolls rose gently with width, like a tutor's eyebrows. If you widened your cart to transport a barrel that ought to have been two, you paid for that innovation at once, and again at the far gate where another clerk congratulated you with the exact fee he had been waiting to use all morning. Some places solved the debate by carving grooves in the deck to whisper, "Here to wheels." Others scratched marks on the gateposts and called them law. Even the polite bridges had opinions. The impolite bridges had spikes. Maintenance, that great art of preventing interesting disasters, used tolls like a calendar. After a storm, the warden ordered a view, which is not a scene but an inspection that looks exactly like a slow stroll with a long list. Nails were counted like sheep. Planks were tested with the kind of tap that quickly separates the trustworthy from the theatrical. Work crews were summoned not by trumpet but by pie. A bakehouse brewed bridge ale and sold it for a penny above normal, the extra coin ordering a peer. You could also buy bridge bread or bridge cheese, products whose brand story read, "When you bite this, a board somewhere lives." It was retail as public works. Scholars who doubt the marketing can look at the accounts, which itemize barrels, hammers, and the occasionally alarming phrase, "For the man who fell." If you ever wondered whether small change can lift heavy stones, a ledger says yes, but please come back tomorrow as well. Mirage, the wall-building cousin of Pontage, often shared the counter. If your town needed both a bridge and a wall, as towns often do when history is feeling ambitious, you split your generosity between crossings and crenels. The clerk's table acquired 2 boxes, 2 seals, and a new pair of gloves for untangling complaints. The trick, as any houseplant knows, is consistent watering. A year with many fairs plumped the bridge. A year with flooded meadows starved it. In thin times, wardens wrote letters with phrases like, "For the love of the common weal," which is a very official way of saying, "The middle plank sighs when carts breathe." Meanwhile, local convents ran charity days where the poor crossed free, and the wealthy paid double, and the saint looked on with that carved expression suggesting he had seen worse revenue models and better hats. Safety rules looked humble, but were ambitious. The simplest was speed, a posted decree that nothing would gallop. Galloping turned wagons into percussion instruments, and percussion is how decks fail. If wind bullied the parapet, porters carried screens, small walls on sticks, to keep candles and tempers alive. In winter, a man with sand walked ahead in a long repeating sentence of footprints. If a plank loosened, someone chalked a cross on it, not to sanctify the hazard, but to warn the second cart not to repeat the first cart's lesson. River pilots, yes, bridges kept them learned where whirlpools practiced, so they could quiet the bargemen before a shout turned into a story. Everything was small. The sun was large. The crossing worked most days, which is how most civilizations succeed. When a bridge died, it left a will. The fallen spans of the Middle Ages entered the afterlife as quarries for thresholds or as ferry ramps with excellent provenance, or as the sort of romantic ruins that cause poets to sit down on wet grass and make sensible people nervous. Money that had been for the bridge moved to for the ferry, and a new bell counted the boats. Meanwhile, the legal right to take tolls, this right was property wandered by inheritance into the pockets of abbeys, lords, or ambitious towns that rebranded the old fee with a new conscience. Sometimes a bypass stole the river's attention, and the retired bridge became a street with extra wind. The shrine stayed, out of habit. People still touched it because memory has its own river. All this seems fussy, but it made travel predictable in a world that could so easily be surprising. The bridge multiplied the market by the number of safe mornings. A pack horse knew the pitch of the planks and trusted the rhythm of the tollman's halting Latin. A peddler could memorize the fee for hazelnuts and summons that number like a charm. A monk carried a cartwheel gauge built into his staff and pretended it was purely devotional. The law, for its part, learned to be local. A rocky river required a different price than a wide, slow one, just as a town with millers set rules that were not quite the rules of a town with weavers. Guides wrote lists of tolls on parchment as thin as an apology, and travelers compared notes in alehouses until each road had a price like a song. There were, as always, little comedies. A clever carrier might grease his hub so the measure slid to mercy, only to discover that the keeper kept claws for enthusiastic hubs. A noble with the wrong token might frown at the wrong clerk, and the saint in the niche being carved remained unbiased. Shepherds trained the smallest lamb to walk on the shaded side, which pleased no one but the lamb. A pig discovered that sitting at the halfway shrine produced admirers in coin, a phenomenon as old as civilization. Someone tried to cross with a traveling puppet theater and argued for the cultural exemption. The bridge eventually allowed it on the condition that the puppets paid, which is to say the humans in charge of the puppets paid while the puppets stared fixedly into the middle distance. If you listen long enough, you can hear the bridge calming people. It says, "We will be here tomorrow and the day after. Your walnuts will not swim." The tolls were not beloved, but they were a kind of lullaby, predictable numbers at predictable gates. In a time when a sudden storm could revise a family's winter, a dependable annoyance was strangely tender. This is perhaps why towns name their bridges the way families name pets: high, long, great, old, new, even when the adjectives complain quietly about truth. Bridge keepers took oaths with a single hand on a single plank, promising to make the river behave like arithmetic. The promise succeeded just often enough to become a tradition, and tradition slept well, which is what traditions most want. We might pause a moment with the tally stick because it is cozy. Imagine a single length of willow held over a candle to dry, the keeper heating his knife and cutting notches with the affection of someone who likes tidy columns. Each notch is a future coin and a future footstep. When the stick is split, the grain chooses a path only that stick can remember. Months later, when the audit arrives with its heavy ink and heavier eyebrows, the two halves meet with a sound that is almost a click and resembles relief. The match proves the keeper honest, the bridge intact, the river currently in its place. The mathematics is audible, a satisfying thing in a world that mostly wrestles. By evening, the paperwork of motion has become the memory of the day. The clerk hangs the scale on its hook and rubs a thumb along the groove worn by so many ropes. The shrine's coins chime into a wooden bowl and sit there like tiny moons. Someone chalks tomorrow's tide on a post. The river does what rivers do, inspects the footings with slow, cold hands, and the bridge does what bridges do, pretends not to notice while thinking about repairs. The toll gate shuts with a forgiving thud. Far on the bank, the bakehouse dims the hearth. No more bridge buns tonight. The saint faces the current. The paperwork sleeps. And if a late traveler arrives and asks in a hopeful voice whether he can cross after hours for half the fee, the keeper quotes the rule softly, not unkindly, because a good rule, like a good lullaby, improves with repetition. If you're still awake, the beer was mildly sour, the bread carried a hint of wood smoke, and the bell sounded like a spoon inside a cup. Season after season, people stepped onto planks that had been checked, paid into boxes that had been counted, and tipped their caps to a stone gentleman who promised very little and delivered exactly that. The miracle was not the saint. It was the schedule. Bridges grew old with their towns, and sometimes the towns grew bold and gave the bridge a roof, turning a crossing into a street that happened to float. Children carved initials in rails that had once been parts of ships. Cats learned the warmer posts. Dogs learned nothing. The river kept its opinions. The law kept its tickets. And in the dark, the tally halves slept together in a chest, curved like crescent rolls, dreaming of tomorrow's matching. You might not expect a civilization to run on feathers, fractions, and how carefully someone writes a name, but Egypt often did, and it did it so quietly that the Nile itself seems to nod. In the early light, a reed pen lifts, a scale pan steadies, and somewhere a water stair on the river gleams 1 cubit higher than yesterday. If you're still awake by the time we reach the part about measuring bread rations with jars that already have the answer carved into their sides, Feel free to subscribe or simply let your eyelids pay the toll on your behalf. Tonight is a slow walk through rules that looked ceremonial and turned out to be plumbing for society. There's no drama, not even a minor argument with a papyrus. Just the low hum of Ma'at, the Egyptian idea that truth and balance are not decorations but infrastructure. Like a road, like a calendar, like the feeling that the scales in the market are honest even when you aren't looking. The judge in his plain linen raises the feather of Ma'at, and everyone remembers the real point of a feather, which is not to fly but to make lightness measurable. It is soft, small, and extremely opinionated about what should weigh more. In court, a feather is a standard the size of a sparrow, yet it keeps contracts from collapsing like unbaked mud brick in the rain. Merchants check weights before stalls open. Scribes recite oaths to weigh with a true weight, because rations are arithmetic, and arithmetic is what keeps dinner from changing its mind when the sun sets. The rule is simple enough to be forgotten and stubborn enough to survive floods. The grain jar must give the same story on Monday that it gave on the day you borrowed it from your uncle. In a river economy where coins come and go and barter solves more problems than speeches, the feather becomes an unofficial audit. Somewhere a notch measuring stick leans against a wall with the patience of a cat. No one calls it beautiful. Everyone calls it obvious, because obviousness is a kind of sacredness that rarely asks for attention. Order continues with the most personal paperwork a kingdom knows, the pharaoh's name. A name written inside a cartouche is both halo and barcode, which is an impressive career for an oval. The rule is fussy and gentle at once. Write the king's names in full, in order, with care, or the document can be dismissed like an unreliable witness. Erasing a royal name is treated as an attack on identity in afterlife, so the law protects ink as if it were bone. Somewhere a scribe pauses to sharpen his reed and thinks about capitals, though he doesn't call them that. Another scribe fetches water because even truth needs a rinse. To outside eyes, it looks like palace etiquette. To Egypt, which keeps memory like a garden, it is a firewall against forgery and a way to keep archives searchable across dynasties. The cartouche ties bureaucracy to immortality in an efficient knot. The cosmic and the clerical shake hands and say, "Yes, we are both very busy. Let us help each other not to smudge." Around the same table, another smaller roll trims the conversation neatly. When you date the document, you do it by regnal year and season, numbering the inundation, the sowing, the harvest. It makes every page a weather report with polite handwriting. Year 12, month 2 of Shamu. The Nile will play its long chord anyway, but the clerk adds a bar line, so music becomes a schedule. If someone later argues about whose goat was whose, the record does not roll its eyes. It points to the season and says, very kindly, "It was the time of high fields and mosquitoes, you know the one." Skeptics sometimes call this the tyranny of tidy notebooks. Egypt calls it Tuesday. Purity arrives like fresh laundry. Temple rules ask for daily bathing and total depilation, which sounds strict until you remember heat and sand and the social behavior of parasites. Shaving removes lice and the little irritants that thrive where sand thrives. Linen breathes and launders without keeping the smell of yesterday's incense. To wear leather in a kitchen that serves gods is a little like wearing a wool coat in a bakery. You can, but you will be a person-shaped oven mitt by noon. Priests glide through rituals like trimmed candles, edges clean, smoke straight. It is not obsession, it is design. Hygiene protects the storerooms where offerings are stored and the kitchens that feed the festival crowds. The rule turns a deity's dining room into a place where the food is not only blessed, but plausibly edible. Meanwhile, barbers acquire a permanent place in theology, which is almost certainly more than they ask for when they learn their trade. Dietary taboos, the kind that seem like eccentricity from a distance, settle neatly when you look at a map. Some gnomes forbid fish for temple personnel, which appears unfriendly until you follow the canals, And remember that stagnant water likes to incubate both stories and diseases. Pigs, much criticized and equally delicious, come under suspicion in certain districts because they share the wetlands with snails that carry afflictions best not discussed during dinner. The rule says gently, not here, not these, and the season nods. In flood months, the taboo steers workers away from the riskiest proteins at the riskiest times. In drier months, people return to whatever their grandmother always knew. This is public health with theology as its carrier wave. A fisherman crossing into a shrine precinct might glance at the sign and shrug. The gods, in this case, are also the Mosquito Bureau. The charm of such rules is their local fit. What one district calls impure, another labels mostly fine, thank you. Not out of contradiction, but because the river draws a new map every year with its silk brush. A priest in the marshy north and a priest in the dry south follow the same ma'at but carry different grocery lists. Egypt is quietly confident about this. It trusts geography to co-author its regulations. This habit makes the civilization look less like a monolith and more like a quilt, each square sewn to its climate. If you enjoy a light punchline in the middle of your anthropology, the same culture that embalms cats by the thousand is also perfectly capable of telling a fisherman to take the day off from tilapia. Balance does not have to be symmetrical to be balanced. Work, water, and time share one instrument, the container that already knows its capacity. Wages arrive not as coins, but as loaves and jars with defined volumes, so a worker can spot cheating by sight and by heft. Rations are measured in haycat and car, in bread that comes with the answer baked into its geometry, which is exactly the kind of low-drama innovation that civilizations adore. At Deir al-Medina, the village of artisans who carved kings a ladder to eternity, complaints about delayed payments are recorded with a patience that deserves its own festival. If bread is short, there is a strike not loud, just very inconvenient for anyone expecting a doorway today. The rule here is that dates on papyrus are verbs. A date promises a jar will tilt when the sun reaches that spot on the temple wall. When it doesn't, a scribe writes a note that sounds dreamy and is actually a deadline in sandals. The line between measured bread and measured treble is the same line, drawn with a reed. Even the jars do a little teaching. Their marks allow a worker to see the difference between a generous ration and a ration that will require an extra fig to keep the afternoon in one piece. The foreman knows his crew by the speed with which they can recognize a fair hecate. In this small economy, fairness is not an opinion. It has a handle. It can be carried home. Numbers eat quietly, but they do eat, and a predictable number feeds a household better than a generous rumor. If you want your laws to sound like weather, you build a 9-meter stone stairs with cubit marks, a water diary carved where boats can read. Only officials may declare the reading, because 1 cubit more means feast and 1 cubit less means famine, and it is unhelpful for every fisherman to publish his own newsletter. The announcement replaces rumor with a number and a tone of voice. Grain rates and storage plans hinge on those carved steps. Flood too low, and granaries become museums of disappointment. Flood too high, and the canal clearing obligations notch up. Citizens summoned with baskets and good humor to lift silt like time-lapse ants. The rule turns a river into a meeting agenda. First the reading, then the plan, then the labor, then dinner, then sleep. No one needs to ask whether the flood has arrived. The staircase answers, dribbling honesty down its own edges. Canal duty reads like civic exercise. Each household owes hours, and those hours arrive in tidy sections of mud. The overseer points to a segment where grass is trying to become poetry and says, "Kindly, but not very kindly, your turn." There is no high rhetoric about this. It is the hydraulic equivalent of sweeping your stoop, but the effect is enormous. Fields fed, mosquitoes discouraged, transport open, neighbors on speaking terms with water. If you need a micro hook, the sort that makes a sleepy smile, Imagine the precise minute when a boy carrying a basket bigger than his opinion learns the exact sound a shovel makes when it bites silt that swam here from Ethiopia. He does not know geography. He learns it by ear. Architecture also has its rules, and they look ceremonial until you realize they are construction manuals spoken in poetry. Stretching the cord sounds like a ritual with a horizon, and in fact it is. Architects perform a star sighting with cord and plumb bob to set a true north and true right angles. The cadence of the right is standardized so teams repeat measurements the same way day after day, week after week. It is not magic. It is muscle memory with astronomy attached. Aligning walls to the cardinal directions reduces drift over hundreds of meters of stone. When you are building a pyramid, an error of a finger at the base grows into an opinion at the top. Piety produces geometry. Geometry keeps roofs from wandering. Somewhere an apprentice holds the bob steady with the concentration of a small sphinx and discovers the pleasure of a lion that refuses to argue. This quiet marriage of religion and engineering continues in the tools. The marquette for sighting stars and the bay for measuring angles become, essentially, organized patience. The rule is not believe. The rule is do the same thing, the same way, under the same sky, until stone behaves like a polite guest. Egypt's love of repetition makes its buildings feel inevitable, as if the walls would have stood up by themselves if only given a stern look. Of course they would not have. They stood because people counted and checked, then counted again, in linen that could survive a midday sun and an afternoon of dust. A pyramid is a theory you can climb without having to agree with it. Security enters with a hiss and a raised eyebrow. Tomb curses are less about scorpions scolding tourists in the afterlife and more about practical deterrence. They are signs that say, "Thieves unwelcome," in the local dialect of gooseflesh. The entrance text promises crocodiles and divine audits, not because crocodiles make house calls, but because a vivid sentence can stand where a policeman cannot. If you engrave a threat well, the rumor market cools. A potential burglar's cousin reads the wall and develops a sudden interest in farming. Warnings also protect irrigation and the labor invested in graves by making interference feel expensive to attempt. The same logic appears on jars with seals, on doors with binding spells, on the exact phrasing of oaths where gods are named in the right order, so paperwork becomes unterrible. A label that says for the festival becomes, with the correct divine punctuation, a force field against casual reallocations. What looks strange in a museum label cannot be opened by the unclean. Reads like good governance in a world of storerooms and seasons. The rule is not trying to startle you. It is trying to keep barley from developing a social life before the harvest. Even the famous storylines about tomb violations, lionized in movies with brassy music, turn out under lamplight to be about logistics and receipts. The fear of divine inspection is a polite way to enforce something simpler. Please return the tools to the place with their names, and also do not take the gold, because it does not belong to your weekend. Meanwhile, every one of these systems, from feathers to star sightings, rests on writing that behaves itself. The reed pen makes narrow lines that dry fast in heat. The palette holds black for prose and red for emphasis because even lists appreciate a splash of ceremony. Scribes sit cross-legged with the alertness of cats and produce memos so clear that 3,000 years later you can still tell who borrowed a donkey and who failed to bring it back on Wednesday. The best part if you enjoy bureaucracy that hums like a beehive is that there are forms for everything. Requisitions for cord, acknowledgments for bread, complaints about the quality of water jars, and little notes that explain why the worker who did not appear at canal duty was in fact attending a funeral, which is an acceptable excuse provided he brings proof in the form of a reasonable story. Egypt's rules often look like polite requests. They are, for the most part, polite insists. Underneath the calm wording is the simple recognition that a river can be both friend and editor. Let it go unedited, and you will spend your days in a canoe inventing new pronouns for mud. Edit it with measurements, and the flood becomes a partner you can schedule. The same applies to names, to weights, to shaved heads, and linen that dries while you drink water in the shade. Balance is not a feeling, it is a curriculum. The culture issues diplomas regularly to anyone who can carry a heket without getting creative, and to anyone who can stretch a cord without turning it into a pretzel. A small absurdity, because Egypt enjoys them in a very serious way. The courtroom feather could, in theory, be replaced. Any feather of the right bird will do, as long as it is the same kind you used yesterday. You do not want a legal system where the pheasant lobby can change sentencing by molting at the wrong hour. Another, the nilometer reader's voice matters. Tradition prefers a calm baritone that makes the number sound inevitable. Shout 6 cubits with excitement, and the price of onions twitches. Whisper it, and farmers nod. You can hear the economy settle like silt. In the evening, when the heat goes out of the stones, and the plumb bob hangs motionless, the rules do what rules do best. They stop talking because they have already spoken. The temple is clean and smells faintly of smoke that remembered incense. The work gang at Deir el Medina breaks bread that still remembers the interior of the jar. The water stair is a dark ladder with moonlight on 2 steps. Someone in a house on a narrow lane folds a scrap of papyrus with a complaint he no longer needs to file because the clerk paid the ration at last. A barber packs away his razor, respectfully, as if it did the theology. A jar with a seal dries on a shelf and considers itself safe. Egypt turns slowly on the axle of small predictabilities and finds the day intact. If you are still hovering at the edge of wakefulness, think of the cartouche again, that oval with a line at the bottom like a tiny plinth. It asks very little of you, only that you write names in the right order, with the concentration you would give a pot of milk over a low fire. This is the mood of the whole civilization. Do it right, not because someone is watching with a stick, but because the universe is happier when jars match, when stairs tell the river's truth, when priestesses smell like soap, and when curses are really caution tape written in the subjunctive. The Nile will rise and fall whether or not your pen behaves, but the city will work better if the feather keeps its job. Tomorrow, the same reed pen will lift. The scale pen will study. The water stair will say something quiet, and everyone will nod, as if the river had sent a polite letter. Bread will be counted by volume and eaten by memory. The cord will stretch, the plumb bob will frown at the earth, and a single straight line will sit thousands of stones at peace. Somewhere a scribe dozes upright, and his dream is entirely legible. Somewhere else the judge puts the feather away, not because truth is finished, but because it has agreed to meet him again in the morning. You might not expect a civilization to stay organized with feathers, ovals, and a staircase for water, but Egypt did it with the satisfaction of someone who labels every jar and then remembers to enjoy the label. The day begins with a reed pen tapping the edge of an ink cake, the market scales doing that tiny seesaw shiver. As they settle and the nilometer, those dignified river steps wearing a thin film of sunrise like a quiet crown. If you re still awake by the time we measure bread with jars that already know their answer, you can subscribe, or you can let gravity finish your eyelids thought. This is a bedtime tour of rules that look ceremonial at first glance and turn out to be the plumbing of daily life, calmly keeping grain prices from inventing plot twists. Egypt loved a regulation the way a cat loves a warm windowsill, with deep, unexplainable contentment and the occasional blink. First comes balance, the kind that has a feather for a logo. The feather of Na'at is not just symbolic. It is a small, portable instrument for weighing truth against convenience. In court, a judge raises the feather as if adjusting the tone of the room. Scribes swear it away with a true weight before the market opens, because rations mismeasured on a Tuesday become whispers by Thursday and a riot by flood season. A scale pan tilts with all the suspense of a drowsy pigeon. It settles, and the price of onions makes its decision. The rule is simple enough to overlook. The jar you sell must hold the same thing today that it held when your grandmother first wrote the recipe on the wall. A civilization without coins for long stretches relies on pronouns like this much and that much, so stability hides in boring places graduated marks on pottery, a notch on a stick, a clerk who will not be hurried. Nothing here is glamorous. Everything here works. Writing the king's name is where ceremony tights its sash and becomes paperwork. Royal names must be written in full, in their proper order, inside a cartouche soft rectangular loop with rounded ends and a little underline. Like an efficient halo that refuses to tip, to erase a royal name is considered a wound. To misspell one is a smaller wound with similar paperwork. The law insists not because letters are precious, but because archives are time machines and time machines require precise keys. The cartouche is both an honor and a barcode, letting officials centuries apart pull the right file as if the past were a very large office with good lighting. A scribe cleaning his nib looks at the empty oval and sees a doorway he is not supposed to bump with his shoulder. He copies carefully. The ink dries with a small shine like a seal blinking in the sun. Somewhere, a future reader sighs with relief. Even dates behave like neat stacks of baskets. Documents are dated by regnal year and by season, inundation, emergence, harvest, so every contract doubles as a weather report. Year 8, month 3 of Shamu, the papyrus breeze, and anyone reading it can feel dry fields underfoot. This is more than style. The Nile is the largest character in every story, and writing its schedule into human promises turns agreements into small rafts that float regardless of gossip. Skeptics might call it fussy. Egypt calls it a map you can fold and put in your pocket. A clerk notes the day, caps his ink, and goes home knowing that if there is a later argument about a goat, the paper will politely point at the river and say, "We were all there, remember, and it was the season of good sandals." Purity expresses itself as laundry that never stops being on the line. In temple precincts, priests shave completely and wear linen rather than leather, which seems extreme until you remember sand, heat, and the ambitious social life of parasites. Depilation removes lice, linen breathes. Both do not collect certain smells the way leather memorizes them. The result is a human-shaped cooling system that is also easier to wash every day. The rule is not about impressing gods with shininess, though shininess never hurt anyone as reputation. It is about keeping storerooms clean, kitchens healthy, and offerings fit for public gatherings that are crowded, joyful, and notoriously sticky. Consider the soft comedy of a temple barber becoming an accessory to theology, his razor an honorary deacon. The hum of a basin, the click of a small jar of oil, and the squeak of clean skin may well be the soundtrack of ritual order. Food taboos come with footnotes and geography. In some districts, temple personnel avoid fish. In others, pork is politely asked not to attend. From a comfortable distance, these bans look like personality traits. Up close, they match the local map of canals, snails, and heat. Stagnant backwaters breed diseases that ride inside the delicious. The rule whispers, "Not here, not now," steering workers away from the riskiest proteins during the riskiest seasons. It is public health broadcast on the channel of holiness. A fisherman entering a sacred compound might glance at a carved notice and shrug, setting aside his tilapia with the resigned wisdom of a person who knows when the river has an opinion. Even within Egypt, there is variation. A taboo in the marshy north relaxes inland, and everyone still agrees about meal 8. Balance does not insist on identical plates. It only asks that both plates stop wobbling. Markets use rules like oven mitts to handle hot prices without getting burned. Wages arrive not in coins, but in measured loaves and jars of beer. The units hecate, car, are not just names, but shapes you can carry, which is the kind of metric that keeps arguments small. A worker knows at a glance whether a jar has been generous or poetic. At Deir el Medina, the artisan's village for royal tombs, a delayed ration produces a beautifully documented strike. The men sit down, not with signs, but with the heavy silence of stonecutters who have found a more stubborn rock. The foreman negotiates. A scribe records everything with the reliable dryness of a desert forecast. The rule underneath is that time is a promise. When a date is written, a jar will tilt. When it does not tilt, a complaint takes on the moral density of a dress block. Even the bread carries a quiet lesson in standardization. Loaves are baked in molds, a geometry that turns food into accounting. The surface bubbles, the edges brown, the volume remains what it was last week. You can hold predictability in two hands and bring it home. It looks humble. It is power. 1,000 small, fair measurements are better for society than a single dramatic act of charity, which tends to shout and then take a nap. Egypt prefers kindness that can be stacked. The water's itinerary is read from stone steps. The nilometer, cut with cubit marks and the tidy courage of mathematics, turns a river into a bulletin. Only officials announce the level. 1 cubit higher is feast and tax change. 1 cubit lower is rationing and careful faces. The voice of the announcer matters calm, is a commodity, and rumor thins like floodwater in sunlight. Grain prices, storage policies, and planting plans hinge on that quiet number. A city waiting for the reading is a city holding its breath while pretending to discuss other topics, like sandals and whose cousin forgot to bring a basket to canal duty again. And there is canal duty, the hydraulic equivalent of sweeping your stoop. Every citizen owes time to dredging. The overseer assigns small rectangles of mud the way a librarian assigns silence, with uncomplaining authority. Men and women lift silt into baskets. Boys learn the exact squelch of Nile clay that is thought about becoming philosophy. Work songs line up shovel strokes with the steadiness of a metronome. It is not heroic. It is indispensable. The result is fed fields, sluggish mosquitoes, and boats that go where they are meant to go. The rule's real beauty is how it turns a flood from a personality into a partner. Water, on a schedule, becomes kind. Building begins with a cord that would like to meet the stars. Stretching the cord sounds theatrical because it is. There is a ceremony at dusk, a plumb bob, and a sighting toward a star that arrives on time. The ritual is a machine for repeatability. Do the same gestures in the same order, with the same patience, and your right angles will stop inventing their own opinions. A pyramid is too big for improvisation. Geometry's humility holds still. Let the bob find gravity's thought becomes architecture's swagger, enormous. Steady, aligned with the north as if the whole planet had nodded. The crew that pulls a rope taut across a foundation is half choir, half survey team. The song they sing is not beautiful so much as useful. It paces the work so a line stays a line. Tools carry names with friendly practicality. The Marquette, a starfinder, is essentially a taut string and a belief in tomorrow's sky. The bay is a right-angle frame that refuses to tell jokes. The measuring rod is a stubborn friend who is never wrong, which is why people treat it with complicated respect. Teams practice until muscle learns numbers. A mason can feel a finger's error through a poem. This is how piety becomes accuracy. You do a sacred thing because the sacred thing is really a checklist, and the gods, if they are paying attention, appreciate a wall that does not wander. Security in a WAM that stores value underground needs language with good posture. Tomb curses read like the older sibling of the modern keep out sign, except the older sibling has crocodiles for metaphors and the authority of repeated whispering. The text promises unpleasant audits in the afterlife for thieves, but its main purpose is here and now psychology. Where you cannot station a guard for eternity, you can post a sentence that walks the night on your behalf. Rumor carries it to the marketplace. A would-be burglar touches the doorway and reconsiders, because even if he doubts the scorpions, he respects the bureaucratic certainty of divine paperwork. The same logic seals jars, binds doors with formulae, and dresses the names of gods in a precise order that turns etiquette into force field. It is not that words are magic. It is that people are beautifully suggestible when a sentence is carved with confidence. There is a domestic version of the curse, a label with an attitude. For the festival is not simply a planning note. With the right invocation, it becomes a claim the whole household agrees to honor. You could call it culture, or you could call it a charm that makes borrowing feel like theft even to the borrower. Storage is safer when language patrols the shelves. Somewhere a jar of beer dries after sealing, looks pleased with its wax, and pretends not to hear footsteps. The household sleeps on the power of small phrases. All of this would drift away without writing that minds its manners. The Egyptian scribal kit is so compact it looks shy. Palette, 2 ink cakes black for most things, red for emphasis, a handful of trimmed reeds, a pot of water. Students learn to pull a line as smooth as river silt and to nest hieratic curves together like respectful neighbors. A good clerk makes papyrus speak at the speed of thought and then sets it to dry before the thought changes its mind. The microdrama of the day is whether the sand sprinkled on fresh ink will streak. It usually does not. 1,000 unremarkable successes become the bedrock of memory. And somewhere in the records there is a note that a man failed to appear for canal duty because his mother-in-law was unwell acceptable if witnessed by 2 names in red, and the city keeps moving. Egypt's rules are elegant because they are ordinary. They police the edges of things that want to slide weight, time, water, stored grain, straight lines, intentions. They do not trust charisma. They trust marks, tiny, boring, loyal. A feather aligns a conversation. A cartouche files a dynasty. A bath turns piety into hygiene. A taboo follows a canal. A jar defines a wage. A staircase reads the river. A chord and star agree on a rectangle. A sentence discourages clever hands. If you want a small absurdity to carry into your dreams, officials preferred the nilometer reading to be spoken in a voice that sounded inevitable. A cheerful 7 cubits could upset the onion market. A calm 7 cubits allowed onion sellers to continue humming. Evening slides down the temple walls, taking the heat with it. The plumb bob hangs like a thought that has finally made up its mind. The last bath of the day is quiet. Linen dries on a cord that takes everything evenly. In Deir el-Medina, a foreman subtracts 1 jar from 1 stack and adds it to another, the ledger satisfied. The staircase by the river glows with moonlight on 2 steps and darkness on the rest, which is a kind of poem about tomorrow's reading. A barber oils his razor because theology has a schedule. A mother ties a knot in a storage basket that means the festival's share and sleeps better because a phrase is standing guard. If you're still here, the feather is back in its case. The cartouche is closed like an eye. The canals are yawning. And the curse texts are bored sentries who prefer to prevent crimes by their mere presence. Somewhere a clerk dreams in neat lines, and his dream still uses red ink for important names because even sleep respects form. The rules will repeat themselves tomorrow with the patience of limestone. The river will arrive at the stairs and confess how high it is. Bread will once again be exactly bread-shaped. Angles will find north. Words will sit on jars like polite cats. And you can drift with them a little lighter than a feather until the scales stop moving. You might not expect a civilization to run on feathers, ovals, and a staircase for water, but Egypt did calmly, methodically, as if bureaucracy had learned to purr. A reed pen lifts from an ink cake and hesitates. the way a heron pauses before it takes one sensible step. A market scale quivers, then decides, and in the palace archive, the air smells faintly of dried papyrus and certainty. If you're still awake by the time we measure bread with jars and count a flood with carved steps, you can subscribe, or simply let your eyes sign the attendance sheet for sleep. No pressure. Tonight is a slow tour of rules that look decorative from a distance and turn out to be the quiet bones of daily life, the feather that calibrates honesty, the cartouche that files a name, the shave that becomes hygiene, the taboo that maps disease, the ration that is a promise, the nilometer that speaks in cubits, the chord that convinces a wall to be square, and the curse that substitutes for a night watch. Nothing dramatic happens. Things merely work, which is much kinder. Balance arrives first, almost as a mascot. The feather of Ma'at is light enough to tickle the ear and heavy enough to study the price of onions. In courts and contracts, the feather is not waved like a wand. It is lifted like a ruler, a reminder that truth is a measurement, not a feeling. Scribes swear to weigh with a true weight before market opens, a daily oath as unremarkable and necessary as rinsing a cup. A scale pan dips, trembles, settles. The sound is barely audible, a soft metal hush, yet when the beam levels, wages make sense, rations match the jar they're poured from, and neighbors greet each other with the unglamorous warmth of people who have not been cheated that morning. Egypt is coin poor for long stretches, so fairness depends on containers that never improvise. Pottery bears neat ridges, half hecate, double hecate like rings on a tree that learned to hold soup. Even numbers have temperature here. They are cool in the hand. The feather sibling is the cartouche, an oval with a tail that looks like a minimalist train ticket. It surrounds a royal name, the way careful fingers surround a flame. Law requires the full and correct name, in the right order, inside that loop. Abbreviations are for shopping lists. The rule is fussy for good reasons. Names in Egypt do routine double duty. They identify a person, and they also feed the afterlife paperwork that keeps the spirit comfortable. Erasing a name is half defamation and half sabotage. Spelling is infrastructure. A scribe who copies a king's name repeats its power, yes. But more importantly, he maintains a filing system that a clerk, a century later, can still search on a hot afternoon without losing his temper. The cartouche is at once halo and barcode. It turns memory into an object you can point at and say, there he is, in the fourth line, between the falcon and the scarab. No, not that one. The other falcon, the one with the double crown. We laugh gently at the precision, but we also appreciate it when our luggage arrives in the right city. Even dates are modestly clever. Documents are labeled by the regnal year and by season inundation. Emergence, harvest, so each promise wears the weather it was born in. Month 2 of Shemu, year 5. The papyrus purrs, and immediately the mind supplies dry fields and early figs. It is impossible to forget that the river is the senior partner in every agreement when the month itself means we are cutting. A contract for grain says, in effect, we wrote this when the water had finished its grand gesture and the land smelled like warm straw, which is a lovely way to prevent arguments later. You cannot win an argument with a season. A clerk strokes a line of ink smooth and tidy, breathes on it so it dries without smudging, and the day can continue. The feather goes back in its case. The cartouche gleams like a shut eye. Everything is labeled enough to be kind. Purity, which sounds pompous, turns out to be a well-lit laundry room. Temple rules demand daily bathing, complete shaving, and linen instead of leather. That reads severe until you imagine heat, sand, and the complicated social life of parasites. Hair is home, and priests become inhospitable landlords. Linen breathes and launders. Leather broods and remembers. A body without hair is easier to wash, easier to keep cool, and less likely to share fleas with sacred storerooms. One can picture the temple barber as an unlikely theologian, his razor the instrument of ritual clarity. A basin splashes. Oil smooths the jaw. The razor sings a practical hymn. The gods, if they attend, are probably relieved. The rule guards more than the altar. It protects the kitchens that prepare offerings, the scribal rooms where scrolls would rather not collect smells, the small cloisters where people have to share air without complaint. Sanctity glows, but cleanliness quietly pays the electric bill. Food taboos wear local accents. In some gnomes, temple personnel avoid fish. In others, they step politely around pork. To an outsider, this looks arbitrary, the culinary equivalent of declaring Tuesdays unfashionable. The map corrects us. Where canals slow into warm backwaters, parasites hitch rides in fish. Where pig husbandry tangles with swamps and flies, pork plays more risk than roll. Don't eat this here is a health bulletin printed in the font of theology. The formality gives the message long legs. A rule that begins as a priestly restriction becomes a habit at home and a rumor in the market, and before long, a whole district has quietly sidestepped a summer illness. Taboos vary because the river does. Egypt prefers a patchwork of good sense over a single grand doctrine. It is less elegant, perhaps, but it fits better, like sandals that remember your feet. Markets run on units that are satisfyingly handleable. Wages arrive as measured loaves and jars of beer, not as coins that need squinting. The heket and the car are not just words. They are volumes with personalities. The heket can be carried. The car is something you nod at respectfully. Rations are predictable, so many loaves, so many jars, making time feel like a trustworthy friend. At Deir el Medina, the village of royal tomb artisans, a delay in ration delivery produces a quiet crisis. The workers do not riot. They sit. They tell their foreman, "We are hungry," with the calm of men who carve eternity for a living and therefore have patience. A scribe records the complaint, the date, the number of loaves late, the path the messenger supposedly took, and the way the foreman's eyebrows behaved. Eventually, the jars tip and the village softens. The rule underneath is that promises are containers. They need to be filled on schedule, or they make a hollow sound. Even bread reveals the state's diligent affection for sameness. Loaves bake in standardized molds, small pyramids and miniature or boat-shaped forms that stack neatly. A mother can look at a day's allotment and know, without arithmetic, whether supper will be comfortable. A standardized loaf is a small act of mercy, identical enough to be fairly counted, forgiving enough to be eaten with one hand while the other keeps the cat from finishing the fish. Food that doubles as accounting is efficient in the way a lullaby is efficient. It does one thing and calms 3 others. The water's mood is read by stone. The nilometer is just steps with numbers, but to Egypt it is a horoscope that only states facts. Officials alone announce the level in a voice selected for calm. A cheerful town crier would be a disaster. Onion sellers do not want pep. They want inevitability. 1 cubit high, taxes can breathe. 1 cubit low, rations are cautious and canal work gets extra polite. Rumor does not entirely vanish, but it thins, like floodwater leaving a shiny field. Meanwhile, canal duty arrives with the inevitability of sand and sandals. Everyone owes labor. The overseer assigns a stretch of mud the way a librarian assigns silence, gently, with an optimism supported by precedent. Baskets thump. Shovels clink against old pottery. Boys learn which kind of wet clay tries to keep the basket as a souvenir. No one writes poetry about dredging. Everyone benefits from it. The rules keep mosquitoes fewer, boats happier, and arguments shorter. Night comes to the building site with a plumb bob and an appointment with the sky. Stretching the cord looks theatrical because it is theater with homework. A rope is pulled tight. A plumb bob steadies. A star that has been on time for centuries is consulted. If you make the same gestures in the same order, with the same tools, you get the same angle. That is the entire trick, and it scales. Small right angles produce square rooms. Patient right angles, repeated and checked, give you a pyramid that still respects the north thousands of years later. Piety here is discipline disguised as ceremony. You sing not because stars care for music, but because rhythm keeps the measuring consistent. Tools are humble, a measuring rod polished by hands, a square that refuses to compromise, a corde with knots like a multiplication table you can tug. Craftsmen learn to feel error the way a musician hears tuning. When the wall stops wandering, everyone sleeps better, including the future. Security, in a culture that stores wealth in the ground, often speaks in complete sentences. Tomb curses are not tantrums. They are legal notices with personality. They promise audits in the afterlife and immediate inconveniences scorpions, crocodiles to anyone who attempts retail inside a grave. The practical function is deterrence. Where guards cannot stand forever, words can. A thief who scoffs at sacred threats still hesitates before a text carved with crisp authority, because a community that writes like that probably owns an efficient rumor network. A sentence can be a patrol if it is walkable. The same logic seals jars formulae wrapped around wax and ties. Storerooms shut with phrases that good servants refuse to argue with. Language does the night shift. It is cheaper than spears and more persistent than alarm bells. There is a household version of the curse, which is really just a label with manners. For festival is a spell and a plan. A jug tacked for the New Year feast becomes difficult for even the most persuasive cousin to borrow. The label sits there like a small, polite guard who has memorized everyone's face. Writing, done right, is social gravity. It keeps intentions from floating off. A mother can sleep because a written promise is now physically present on the shelf. And even if her brother-in-law is very charming, he is not quite as persuasive as ink. Back in the archives, the scribal kit sits like a sleeping bird. Palette, black and red cakes of ink, a few slim reeds, a water pot with a deliberate mouth. The red ink is for names, headings, warnings, brighter even when the eyes are tired. Students practice until their wrist can draw a line of hieratic that looks like a river making good decisions. A competent scribe writes fast enough to catch thought, but not so fast that the sand he sprinkles to dry the line will streak. There's a small drama every afternoon. Will the papyrus curl? Will the cat sit on the wet line? Will a gnat take a late walk through the king's name? Usually no. The quiet miracle is how many tiny things go right, day after day, until a bureaucracy becomes a memory palace. We remember Egypt because Egypt remembered Egypt so politely dot from a distance. These rules can look ornamental, even whimsical. A feather to judge honesty, a loop to protect a name, a shaved head for holiness, a fish that is holy in one district and suspicious in another, a wage measured in beer, a staircase that predicts taxes, a string that commands granite, a sentence that tells thieves to reconsider their life choices. Up close, they are the fine-tuning knobs of an economy without many coins, of a climate with one enormous season and two supporting acts, of towns linked by water that arrives on its own schedule. The rules make a civilization survivable by making it predictable. Predictability is not exciting unless you have tried living without it. It is the difference between a market that opens on time and one that opens with apologies. It is the difference between food that stacks and food that argues. It is frankly the difference between sleep and pacing that evening slides over the river. The nilometer steps glow where moonlight meets water. Someone will read them at dawn in that excellent, inevitable voice. In a side room of a temple, a priest hangs his linen from a cord that remembers his height. At Dir el-Medina, a foreman draws a small circle on a tablet to note one jar received, one jar promised, and finds the circle satisfying in the way only closed shapes are. On a courtyard roof, a surveyor cleans his plumb bob and listens for the microscopic thud when the point kisses stone. In an necropolis, a carved text gazes out and does not blink. That is the entire job. A mother ties a knot around a basket handle and hums the label under her breath, which is superstition only if the basket disagrees. Across town, a clerk caps his ink with the stern gentleness of a person who believes that tomorrow deserves an orderly desk. If you are still listening, let the feather rest in its box and the cartouche go quiet around its letters. The river will declare itself in the morning. The loaves will leave their molds with the dignified sigh bread makes when it is sure of itself. The cord will stretch, the bob will steady, the wall will accept advice. The jars will keep their secrets unless asked the right question by the right measure at the right time. And the words, so many, so neat, will continue their night watch, keeping social gravity turned on. You may drift the way a barge drifts when the current knows exactly where the channel is. Tomorrow, inevitably, the feather will weigh, the staircase will count, and the day will be square. You might not think a civilization could be organized by a feather, a loop drawn around a name, and a staircase that measures water, but Egypt enjoyed that sort of gentle precision. A reed pen touches its ink cake, pauses like a heron testing the river, and the whole day begins to line up. Markets, kitchens, barges, and thoughts. If you're still awake when we get to the part about paying people in bread, that already knows its own volume, feel free to subscribe, or let the Nile subscribe for you by lapping the bank twice. Either way, the current is unhurried. Tonight, we drift through rules that look decorative at first glance and turn out to be the quiet machinery of comfort, honesty weighed against a feather, names protected by ovals, linen chosen over leather because humidity has opinions, rations counted into jars that behave themselves, the flood reported by steps and cubits, straight walls corded with string and stars, and inscriptions that run the night shift in place of guards. There is no drama, just the slow satisfaction of things that keep working when no one is watching too hard. A judge in a cool hall holds a feather of Ma and does not raise his voice. The feather looks whimsical until you imagine the alternative, haggling about weight with every onion purchase and shouting about contracts until the gods start closing their shutters. May'et is a pretty word for a practical habit. Merchants swear it away with true weights before the first customer arrives, because the morning is calmer when the scale does the arguing. The beam dips, breathes, and settles. There is a tiny metal whisper the ear never quite stops liking. If the counterweights have been filed honestly and the measure jars match their labels, then rations, wages, and temple offerings can all be moved like chess pieces that learn to be polite. Egypt was often short of coin, long on grain, and permanently in need of predictability. So fairness lived in containers. A Heket was a Heket and did not wake up on Thursdays deciding to be generous. Pottery molds remembered their sizes the way old cats remember sunny windows. The feather, so light, had the heavy job of making numbers behave in public. Names behaved too when fenced with care. The cartouche, the oval loop with a little tether like a tail, kept a king's name from getting chipped, shuffled, or teased. Scribes had to write the full name in order inside the loop, or the document was treated like gossip and set aside. Egypt's neatest trick is the way religion and paperwork share desks. A name is not only a label, it is a forwarding address for the afterlife. Erasing it harms reputation and retirement plans. That turns spelling into ethics. A carver who repeats the royal name exactly is not flattering the crown so much as maintaining the filing system of heaven and archive at once. The cartouche is both halo and barcode. It elevates and it indexes. Modern readers squint at a wall of hieroglyphs and see art. A scribe's colleague would see a table of contents that can be skimmed with tea in hand. The oval can also be a small social contract. If the name is there, complete and housed correctly, then the message inside the text must take the same care. Egypt trusted shapes to behave like locks. The calendar colludes. Documents date themselves by year of the king and by season. Akhet when the river swells. Pere when fields emerge. Shemu when harvest finishes sentences. A promise written in month 3 of Shemu comes pre-dried, as it were, smelling faintly of cut straw. The weather is part of the contract. It is difficult to pretend surprise about shipment delays when the date says the fields are underwater in a tidy script. Seasons act as witnesses who never forget and never grow tired of nodding. A clerk waits his read, draws a black line, adds a red heading for clarity, and sighs the sigh of someone who has earned the quiet right to be boring, which is another word for trustworthy. In a world kept orderly by jars and strings, boredom is a public service. Purity begins in the bath and ends in a linen closet that hums with reason. Priests shaved completely, not out of impatience with barbers, but because hair is a hospitality suite for fleas and their cheerful cousins. Shaving daily makes cleanliness less ceremonial and more mechanical. Linen, light as the phrase, of course, wins over leather, which in Egyptian heat clings to the skin like a bad argument. Linen breathes, launders, and forgives. Leather remembers. The temple is a crossroads, kitchens preparing offerings, storerooms guarding grain, scribal rooms where lines of text hope not to absorb anyone's lunch and hygiene draws. A thin line of silence through the bustle. There's elegance in the unadorned. A shaved scalp dries fast. A linen skirt can be swished against stone and come away superior, and no one has to share lice with the divine. Even the razor sings softly when it works, a tiny hymn to prevention. Food rolls drift across the map like regional accents. In one district, fish is a poor colleague. In another, pork minds the door from the outside. Outsiders call it superstition, but the river has a rebuttal. Parasites travel in slow water. Some canals are slower than others. Pigs thrive where mud and flies throw parties. Some farms or SVP more enthusiastically. Temple staff avoid what local conditions have marked risky, and a rule that begins at a threshold ends up in kitchens nearby through the persuasive power of habit. We do not eat that here, spreads more effectively than leaflets. Theology gives the rule a long memory. We often say religion sets tables. In Egypt, it also rewrote menus to please the epidemiology of summer. Nothing absolute, nothing universal, just the gentle mesh of belief with geography. The gods, if asked, might remark that they like their incense fragrant and their assistants. Undash itchy dot wages arrive as things that can be eaten without translation. A worker is paid in loaves and beer, both baked or brewed in standardized units. The mold for a worker's loaf is as unromantic and kind as a measuring cup. It keeps domestic arithmetic brief. The beer jar knows its duty. At Deir el-Medina, the village of tomb artisans, rations are recordable and therefore arguable. When they are late, the men do not smash a gate. They go on strike by sitting down where everyone can see they're not working. A scribe notes the date, the hours, the missing loaves, the path the messenger claimed to have taken, and the fact that his sandals looked tired when he said it. Bureaucracy, which elsewhere may produce only yawns, here produces dinner. Predictable rations make personalities kinder. Bread that comes on time turns quarrels into discussions. Even the cats relax, there will be crumbs eventually. No need to insinuate. The flood, too, is converted into a number with a bedtime voice. The Nilometer looks like an elegant staircase dropped into the river's throat. On the steps, notches. By the notches, cubits. At the top, an official who reads aloud with the serene authority of someone announcing sunrise. Too low, tax rates loosen. Dredging schedules thicken. Too high, plans for canal repairs become sentences rather than pencils. Exactly right, there is polite applause in grain silos. The official tone is important. News about floods must arrive like a weathered uncle with sober eyebrows, not like a market crier competing with pomegranates. The reading replaces rumor with measurement and converts famine into logistics early enough to matter. Behind the announcement lurks the rule that everyone owes canal work. Baskets line up. Mud moves from inconvenient to constructive. The day becomes a procession of small shovels and the unteachable skill of stepping in muck without losing one's sandals to its affection. By evening, the channels breathe again, which is the agricultural equivalent of fresh sheets. When the sun goes down, architects ask the stars for directions using nothing more glamorous than a string. Stretching the cord is a ceremony devoted to the radical idea that repetition is trustworthy. A plumb bob settles. A star is acknowledged. A right angle is invited to stay for years. If the gestures are done in order, with patience and the same tools, stone behaves. Walls keep secrets. Corners resist wandering. A future inspector from year 2000 BCE can smack a square against a block and nod with professional contentment. The tools are sturdy and friendly. Knotted rope for counting, a wooden set square, a measured rod that has been stroked smooth by hands bored in a loving way. Tapping a block into line, a mason learns the difference between almost and actually as a sensation in the wrist. The string sings a note of straightness. The star says, good, again. Meanwhile, security, having no patience for overtime, hires sentences. Tomb inscriptions that tourists call curses are, from a local angle, strongly worded public notices with a supernatural aftertaste. They promise audits from busy gods and immediate pest-based inconveniences for thieves. The gods, like all administrators, enjoy a good form. The warnings are both theater and policy. Where guards cannot stand forever, carved threats shine perpetually. A would-be robber, kneeling with a chisel, notices the grammar and wonders how many people had to agree before this sentence was approved for stone. This is community standing behind ink, transformed into stone to save breath. The same trick appears on vessels sealed with clay, phrases pressed into wet circles, claiming contents and forbidding curiosity. Words do the night shift with remarkable stamina. They never need water, only sunlight. An ordinary house uses lighter versions of the same philosophy. A jar labeled for Feast of Wepet Rempet is protected by a future expectation that becomes heavier every time someone glances at the label and smiles. A daughter tasked with bringing oil from not this jar will feel watched by the handwriting itself, which is a much cheaper system than hiring her brother to glare. A child learns to write by tracing signs. At the same time, the child learns that writing gets its way without raising its voice. The social technology here is exquisite. A sign on a door is a conversation that continues politely, even when nobody remembers who started it. Back in the court again. The feather returns to its box. Markets close with that slow rustle of woven baskets that is impossible to rush. Scribes tidy their palettes, 2 wells for black and red ink, a recess for reeds, a little water pot that looks perpetually thoughtful. Red pushes forward names, headings, and warnings. Black carries most of the sentence like a reliable donkey. Apprentices practice slanted hieratic until their hands understand when to lift and when to curve. Every system of writing has a choreography, and Egypt's is patient and neat. A young scribe learns the art of sprinkling sand to dry a line without bruising it, the way you learn not to slam a door in a house that keeps its afternoons for reading. The writing desk is a calm machine. The world, fed with labels, relaxes. The more you stare at the rules, the less superstitious they look. Shave to outrun parasites. Wear linen because it forgives the weather. Vary taboos by district because rivers do not copy themselves faithfully. Pay in loaves and jars to keep arithmetic edible. Announce the flood so rumor takes a day off. Point at the sky before laying stone because stars are punctual and our eyes are not. Inscribe a threat when you cannot post a guard. Loop a name so memory has a handle. All these are ways to invite routine to stay for dinner. Routine is the best guest. It does the dishes and leaves quietly. Night uncurls along the Nile in that deliberate way it has. The Nilometer steps darken. A cat chooses a warm wedge of wall that remembers the day. From a workshop roof, a surveyor gives his plumb bob one last complimentary look before hanging it up like a small, tired comet. In a temple court, a priest rings a cloth, pats a head as smooth as a clear thought, and lays out tomorrow's linen like weather prepared in advance. At Deir el-Medina, a foreman adds a dot to a tally, the kind of dot that keeps peace among neighbors, and closes his kit with the tender click of a man who believes hinges have feelings. Down in the necropolis, sentences glow a little with the moon, adequate to the night. If your eyes are heavy, let the feather be the last thing you think of, light and inarguable. Let the cartouche close around the day's name like a door pulling itself shut without a sound. The jars will keep their measurements until morning. The calendar knows which season it is, whether or not we do. The cord will stretch again. The star will agree graciously. The wall will choose to be square. The staircase will report the river with the manners of an elderly librarian. And the words will keep everything from drifting, which is a fine job to have at midnight. You can drift then. The rules will keep watching, and they never ask for thanks. You might not expect a world to run on a feather, a loop around a name, and a staircase that measures water. But Egypt liked its rules elegant and light. The way a reed pen's tip touches ink and leaves just enough to mean something. A quiet hall, limestone cool. A judge who lifts the feather of Ma'at and watches the balance calm down, no thunder. No gavel, only a scale tray deciding how to sit. If you're still awake by the time we get to the stairway that reports the river's mood in cubits, feel free to subscribe, or simply let the Nile subscribe you by lapping the bank the approved number of times. Either way, we'll proceed slowly. The people who painted gods on walls also painted lines on jars so wages would fit. They shaved because hair has hobbies and lice are among them. They wrote the king's name inside an oval not just for honor, but so later readers could find the right paragraph. Everything looks ceremonial until you notice how often dinner arrives on time because of it. Tonight, we will let the rules do the talking while we do the yawning. A feather, to begin with, seems decorative, a soft idea. But a feather of Ma'at is a working tool, like a ledger with a polite sense of humor. In the courts, it stands for truth. In the markets, it stands for weights that refuse to improvise. Merchants swear to weigh with a true weight, which sounds poetic until you imagine buying barley by a measure that changes its mind at noon. The beam leans, breathes, and levels. A small counterweight, burnished by many thumbs, takes its place with the confidence of someone whose job description is just the word enough. Prices, rations, and offerings all begin from that moment when the scale decides what is fair today, and the next day, and the next, and we can stop arguing. Egypt was frequently short of coin, but never short of containers. So fairness was poured and tied off with string. A hecat, the measure for grain, was not a mood, but a volume that remembered itself. Potters made molds that quietly refused to change. Bakers filled standardized baskets. Brewers filled jars with shoulders that indicated how much gossip the beer would stand before it was full. If you are thinking that this sounds like bureaucracy, it is But bureaucracy with good lighting and a fondness for a predictable breakfast, names were kept just as carefully. A king's name was written inside a cartouche, a neat oval with a tiny rope tail, an elegant fence that meant, don't abridge, don't juggle, don't misfile. The law required the full name, in order, within the loop, or the document could nap in the reject pile indefinitely. It seems fussy until you remember that to erase a name was to erase a person's afterlife address, which is the sort of misdelivery no post office wants. So a scribe copies the titulary exactly, red ink for emphasis, black for the sentence, all of it tucked within that protective ellipse. The cartouche is half halo, half barcode. Priests see sanctity. Archivists see searchability. It lets you skim a wall the way you might skim a table of contents, eyes catching loops and thinking, ah yes, the one with strong bull appearing in Thebes. The dignified oval also tells you how to behave. If the name is intact and well housed, then the message had better be equally careful. You can hear the scratch of the pen insist on precision. The reed is cut to a slant, dipped in soot black ink, and the strokes arrive with the sleep-inducing regularity of rain on lintel stone. The calendar is a partner in this politeness. Documents announce themselves by year of a king and by season. Acet when the flood swells, Pare when fields emerge. Shimu for harvest, and the date quietly explains whether a promise should be wading boots or sandals. Schedule disputes become softer when everyone can point at the season and shrug the same shrug. There is a practical calm to it. A clerk writes a receipt in month 2 of Pare, and you can smell the damp silt drying. His script holds a little more sunshine each line. Scribes mark headings in red, so the eye won't wander, and underline totals, so the fingers stop counting exactly when they should. They sprinkle a pinch of sand over fresh ink the way bakers dust flour on a board, not for show, only because it works. The whole office is a machine for making reality modestly legible. It's hard to imagine a civilization better designed for the bedtime mind than one where truth is measured. Named in an oval, placed in a season, and set aside in a basket of known capacity, purity was managed with tools. 2, and one of those tools was the razor. Priests shaved completely, which seems excessive until you invite Egyptian heat to the meeting. Hair is generous to small travelers. Shaving is not. Daily bathing in cool water that smells faintly of the river at dawn removes yesterday before it can take up residence. Linen, not leather, becomes the uniform because linen breathes and launders and does not remember arguments. Leather holds grudges. Linen forgives. Rituals that look mystical are often just extensively tested hygiene. In a temple, you have kitchens, storerooms, incense that wants to cling to everything, food offerings that need to be kept wholesome, and a schedule that respects the idea of sunrise. Shaving and washing turn chaos into a routine that even mosquitoes eventually respect. The razor's song is practical theology. Food taboos meander across the map like dialects. In some gnomes, fish is politely declined. In others, pork minds the door from the outside. Outsiders see superstition. The river, if rivers could lean forward and speak, would explain parasites. Slow water breeds certain surprises. Certain canals become more enthusiastic about those surprises than others. Pigs are wonderful machines for converting leftovers into more pig. Unfortunately, they're also charming to particular worms. Temple staff avoid the riskiest menu items for that district, and what starts as priestly caution becomes community habit because households, like any tradition that lowers the number of headaches on a Tuesday. A band carried by theology grows legs that walk quietly from threshold to pantry to lunch. It is not absolute. It is neighborhood specific. Theology wears local shoes. A cook, sharpening a knife that has seen generations of onions, knows which fish the gods prefer because the gods read the same. Water levels, she does that the economy speaks bread and beer fluently. Wages arrive in loaves, baked in molds that have opinions about size. The mold is the real boss. Bakers and officials obey it together. Beer is portioned into jars that announce their capacity by how they sit under the hand. At Deir el Medina, the village of royal tomb builders, rations are not feelings, they are entries. A scribe notes, so many loaves, so many jars, so many bunches of onions and polite accompaniment. When deliveries slip, the workers stage what may be the sleepiest strike on record. They sit down in a place no one can ignore and wait, leaving the tools covered and their conscience at ease. The complaints are specific and neighborly. The ration is late. The messenger was delayed by auditing his excuses, and the water carrier said his donkey felt contemplative. The record turns frustration into paperwork rather than noise. Pay people in edible units, and arguments have to fit on a line. It is all deeply non-dramatic, which is why it worked for centuries. The sacks sigh their dusty sighs. The jars thump the same shoulder of the same man, the same distance. And therefore, the day moves forward. Dot between the fields and the temples stands a staircase that listens to the river. The Nilometer's stone steps, carved with cubit marks, descend into the water like an unhurried sentence. An official reads the level aloud in a voice that knows it is being compared to last year's voice. Too low, and taxes relax. Dredging intensifies. Prayers become a little more pointed, but the engineering gets the first draft. Too high, and warnings ripple out to people who store their possessions with opinions about height. Just right, and silos practice smiling. The news is measurement, not rumor, and rumor is surprisingly allergic to measurement. The announcement takes 5 minutes and prevents 5 months of nonsense. Afterward, canal work rotates through the population. There is a lovely competence to the whole thing. Neighbors who disagree about almost everything agree about where mud belongs. Children watch and learn 2 facts at once: that sandals are loyal unless you test them, and that public works are a long, slow story you can join without needing a speech. Night comes, and the architect's favorite ceremony begins, one that turns starlight into perpendicular faith. Stretching the cord, they call it. A rope is pulled tight, a plumb bob is encouraged to mind gravity. A star is consulted with the same respectful squint used for senior masons. The aim is a right angle that will resist generations of gossip and weather. The tools are simple and satisfied. A measuring rod polished by hands, a wooden set square, a knotted cord that hums faintly when it is truthful. It is a pageant of competence. If you do the same motions at the same pace with the same attention, stone behaves like a domestic animal that enjoys routine. Walls point north because someone asked them nicely in exactly the right way. The result is not just geometry, but memory embedded in stone. Future repair crews will feel the line under their fingers and think a person they never met. Guard duty is outsourced to language. The so-called curses on tomb walls are formal notices dressed as hauntings. They promise audits from gods and unwelcome companionship from scorpions to anyone who borrows what was meant to stay. They are public policy that can be read at night without torches once you know the text by heart. Egypt's security budget includes grammar. Seals pressed into damp clay do similar work. A jar closed with a coil of linen and a dollop of mud holds a sign pressed by an official's ring, saying content, owner, consequences. A thief facing such a seal confronts not just a lump of earth, but an entire committee, summarized. The cost of disobedience goes up before any guard wakes. You can call it magic if that helps you sleep, but in practice it is literacy with good posture. Meanwhile, the household version of all this hums along. A mother labels a jar Festival of Webit Renpei and stores oil there for the new year. The label becomes a small time machine. A child told to bring oil, but not from that jar. obeys a set of letters more readily than an older sibling's face. Writing has the nicest authoritarian style, calm, persistent, a polite refusal to argue. The kitchen adopts temple logic. Shave the problem, wash it, give it linen, label it, and it will behave. Even the cat, who enjoys chaos as a theological position, learns where it is expected, and sleeps there as if the rule were its idea. Back in the office, the reed pens dry under a square of woven matting. The black ink is lampblack and water and a little gum. The red is iron-rich and content with drama only when needed. Red announces names and warnings. Black carries the day's sentences across the page, the way a dependable donkey carries woven crates to market. Apprentices copy model letters until their wrists understand when to lift at the end of a sign and when to let it run into the next, which is Egypt's version of learning to breathe between measures in music. The desk is a pocket civilization. 2 inkwells, a slot for reeds, a neat pile of Astraka broken pottery with opinions about second drafts, ready to receive practice lines. There's nothing urgent here, nothing except the soft rule that tomorrow's readers deserve legible thoughts. The rules, when taken together, look less like superstition and more like customer service for reality. Shave to outrun things that itch. Choose linen because it minds its manners. Keep diets local because parasites are local. Pay in loaves and jars because math is easier when dinner agrees. Read the flood and tell the truth before rumor wakes up. Ask stars about angles because stars keep good hours. Hire words because words enjoy night work and never ask for rations. Loop a name because memory needs handles. Each rule is small, and together they keep boredom safe, which is one of the nicest ways a society can spend its energy dot by late evening. The Nilometer steps are just darker shapes under the moon. The river sounds like someone turning a long page. In a courtyard, a priest folds tomorrow's linen. The fold lines look like quiet promises. A foreman at Dar al-Medina dots the last figure of a delivery, sets down his pen, and flexes a hand that has measured out food for families he can list in his sleep. An architect sets the plumb bob in its wooden case and feels that pleasant emptiness behind the eyes that comes from straight lines behaving. Down in the necropolis, sentences in gold and black pretend not to watch anyone, which is the toughest kind of vigilance to master. And all across the delta and valley, the household jars wait with labels that make sense in the dark, which is the point dot if sleep is coming. Let it come like a barge drifting sideways until someone nudges it into the landing with a soft thump. Think of the feather's weight, which is almost none and somehow keeps whole markets sensible. Think of the cartouche wrapping a name in an oval that says, "I will be here when you look." Think of bread baked to a size that others have trusted, beer that stops filling itself at the right shoulder of the jar, sandals left at the edge of a clean canal in a tidy row, a cord stretched between 2 posts humming. The river will rise a little higher or a little lower, and the staircase will say so without excitement. The labels will keep being legible. The rules will keep doing their quiet work after we close our eyes. We can drift then in a place where even the bureaucracy is gentle and nothing is urgent besides the next yawn. You might not expect a civilization to run on a feather, a loop drawn around a name, and a staircase that measures water. But in the long, slow hush along the Nile, these were the reliable gears of daily life. A judge weighed truth with the feather of Ma'at, and the scale behaved like a sensible friend. A scribe wrapped the king's name inside an oval that acted like both halo and filing tab. A clerk read river levels from stone steps and turned the Nile's mood into numbers that soothed towns. If you're still awake by the time the plumb bob finds a right angle by listening to a star, you're doing very well. If you'd like to subscribe, you may, though in the spirit of Ma'at, I promise to weigh that. Decision with a true weight and promptly forget. And if you fall asleep mid-dash feather dot, the feather looks like decoration until you. Place it on a scale and watch arguments settle. In the court, truth is not thunderous. It is politely calibrated. In the marketplace, the same idea proceeds in sandals. Merchants swear to weigh with a true weight. Before the sun gets too interested in the roof beams, and the beam balances with a little sigh that says breakfast will be fair. Egypt was famously light on coins and heavy on containers, so justice came in volumes. A heket for grain, a car for larger feelings, a basket with a memory of its own. The mold determines the loaf, and the loaf becomes a sentence the baker can read with his hands. When you standardize your jars, rumor becomes tired very quickly. The jar sits there, shoulder proud, stating how much it holds, whether or not anyone has an opinion. Sometimes civilization is nothing more than a row of containers that refuse to improvise. Names, especially royal names, were not left to wander. The cartouche, that small rounded loop, fences the title like a garden path. Write the full string in order inside the loop, or the document might as well be a nap. To erase a name was to dent a person's afterlife commute, which is bureaucratic cruelty of a very high order, so the law guarded ink like bone. The cartouche is also a navigation tool. When you scan a temple wall with a drowsy eye, those ovals pop like bookmarks. You find Lord of the Two Lands the way you find your place in a cookbook without waking the house. It is ceremonial, yes, and also superb indexing. If a modern office had thought of this, every memo would carry an oval that says, "Here is the part you need for the meeting," and we would all go home earlier. Ideally with red dot dates too, were little anchors. Scribes wrote in the year of the king, in the season of Akit or Pere or Shamo, so that contracts wore the weather they expected. A lease in flood season is a promise with white cuffs. A receipt in harvest reads like a crisp sheet shaken out in the courtyard. Red ink marked headings, black carried sentences. A pinch of sand dried the strokes, and the page acquired the tender grit that keeps office hours honest. A straka, the shards of broken pottery kept drafts and notes. Nothing is quite so soothing as a shelf of reused fragments that volunteered for second lives as practice sheets and reminders. Send onions, repair door hinge, praise to the good scribe. The broken bowl becomes a to-do list and finds it much less stressful. There is a peaceful logic to the temple rules about cleanliness. Priests a shaved head to heal. Hair, after all, has hobbies, and one of them is hosting extremely small social gatherings. The razor hums, the basin cools the skin, and linen takes over where leather would have sighed and held heat. Linen breathes, launders, and forgives. Leather is magnificent, but it remembers every conversation and stores it for later. In a place of incense, food offerings, and early mornings, the simpler fabric wins by agreeing to be washed every day. To the gods it looked like purity. To the storehouse it looked like hygiene. The result was fewer interruptions of ritual by tiny uninvited participants, and fewer kitchen staff out sick during almond cake week, which, by unspoken consensus, mattered a great deal. Food taboos drifted across the map like accents. In one, gnome fish stepped outside for the duration. In another, pork considered itself not on speaking terms with the stovetop. Outsiders called it superstition. Grandmothers called it Tuesday. The Nile, if rivers gave lectures, would have pointed at particular backwaters where parasites posted help-wanted signs, and at certain herds with complicated public relations. The rule kept riskiest proteins politely out of reach, especially for temple personnel who could not afford even a brief argument with their digestion. Theology carried the practice. Local water wrote the fine print. A cook knew which canal raised which species with which mood. She could recite the line of priests who avoided that fish not because a myth said so, but because everybody remembered the summer of the rash. You can call it purity. The physician would quietly call it data. Work was measured in bread and beer. which is the sort of payroll system that economists secretly envy. At Deir el Medina, the village of royal tomb workers, rations flowed by schedule, loaves counted, jars counted, onions for brightness, a little oil for morale. Deliveries late? The scribes made the delay official by writing it down, and the workforce staged what may be the world's gentlest strike by sitting in the right place until management listened. Complaints cited the exact number of days, the exact missing jars, and often the exact name of the messenger whose donkey had reflective tendencies. Bureaucracy, when done in barley units, becomes narratable without raised voices. You can imagine the meeting. We respectfully request our beer, and across the tablet the scribe notes. They are correct. It is the lullaby version of labor relations. Turning water into sentences required architecture. The manometer stone stairs, etched with cubit marks, descended into the river like a patient paragraph. An official read the level and announced it in numbers, the way you announce birthdays. 1 cubit above average meant a season that could afford to be generous. 2 below meant careful ledgers and a lot of shovels and canals. Rumor dislikes numbers. It packs up when confronted with a measured step. Taxes adjusted, harvest predictions recalibrated, and the calendar felt the nudge from a staircase that had no interest in drama. If you think of it as a forecast app carved in limestone, you will not be very wrong. People checked the reading and decided whether to plan a little. More lentil or a little more patience. Geometry wore ceremony like a good cloak. Stretching the cord, the foundation right, used a taut rope, a plumb bob, and a star. The star is the quiet authority. It cannot be bribed. It does not look away. The rope hums when true, which is the most pleasing way a rope can behave. The plumb bob settles, the set square nods, and a right angle blossoms where 2 stones meet. Performed again and again, the rite becomes warmed routine. Future masons feel those first decisions like a pulse under the blocks. The north wall points to north because someone asked it politely and correctly the first time. Corners that are properly spoken to do not wander. What seems mystical is really the long kindness of repetition, security, for a society that preferred propriety to wrestling, naturally employed sentences. Tomb texts told potential thieves what would happen, eloquently. Scorpions were advertised as consultants. Crocodiles took the night shift in the chapter headings. Most of all, the dead promised audits, which is the one haunting that has ever actually deterred embezzlement. Seals on jars did everyday versions of the same. A coil of linen, a slug of clay, a stamp from an official ring. Breaking one startled not only the clay, but also the owner's entire list of acquaintances, because everyone could read a damaged seal even in low light. You could hire guards, or you could hire literacy. Egypt saved on salaries. At home, the same logic made a life. Jars were tidy labels. Sesame oil for festival, beer for neighbor's son, grain for ordinary days. The label kept nighttime honest. In the dark, a written word is steadier than a cousin's memory. A mother with 3 tasks and 2 hands borrowed a scribe's trick and made the most important. Jar red marked, just the line of pigment where the thumb would land. Children learn to read the pantry first, which builds a certain morality into breakfast. If a label says, "not today," even cats will consider it. And the ones that do not consider it get a gentle elaboration of the rule in the form of a closed door. Scribes themselves carried a small toolkit that could be described with only a little exaggeration as the sleep-iced orchestra, reeds cut to a careful slant, black ink made of soot and water, red ink made from ochre and a sense of occasion, a palette with 2 wells, a roll of papyrus that crackles pleasantly when unrolled, and a bucket of patience. They copied model letters until their wrists could think on their own. They learned where to leave a hairline gap between signs so the sentence could breathe, which is not something you pick up from philosophy but from afternoons. The act of writing smoothed the day the way a millstone smoothed grain. Nothing dramatic. Only the relief of consistency turned into nourishment. The laws rule about names, write the king's titulary in full. Within the loop, and sequence seems pedantic until you watch it catch a forgery before lunch. A missing epithet here, a clumsy sign there, and suddenly a document has the wrong shoes for the ceremony. Officials do not need detectives. They need ovals with standards. Defamation, that smoky thing, is tamed because names are treated as objects with edges. To scuff one is to scuff a sacred container. Even modern paperwork could learn from this. Fewer public quarrels when labels refuse to participate. Outside, the canal crews work in a rhythm that might have been set by the ibis. Dredge, pile, tamp. Dredge, pile, tamp. The rules assign sections and pauses because you cannot shout all of it to a river and expect compliance. Everyone knows where their stretch begins and ends, and the water moves along with grudging respect. Mosquitoes dislike flowing channels. Boats like them. Green barges like them very much. A city fed by canals looks a lot like a ledger in which all the zeros are open circles for boats to travel through. Architecture continued the same. Logic upward. Align walls to the north. Set rooms in rectangles your grandmother would approve of. Repeat measurements in the same order week after week, so the building keeps the habit. Piety produces geometry. Geometry protects roofs. When the wind tests the corner and finds it true, it loses interest and goes to bother the desert where there are dunes prepared to enjoy the attention. A roof that does not wander keeps its shade where you left it. People who live under such roofs have time for naps. The charm of these rules is how gently they insist. Shave because heat enjoys arguing. Bathe because water is patient. Wear linen because it minds its manners. Avoid certain fish in certain places because the canal has a personality you have learned to respect. Skip pork in this district because the herd and the climate have a complicated relationship. Pay wages in loaves and jars because the stomach recognizes those units without footnotes. Read a stare of water instead of a rumor that took the scenic route. Ask a star about a right angle because stars have tenure. Hire words to guard jars because words worked evenings. By now the Nile. Does dark silver and the Nilometer's steps are reading themselves. The last clerk of the day runs a palm over the carved cubits, not to clean them, just to acknowledge them. The way you pat a mule that carried something correctly. In a courtyard, priest folds a line of linen into a tidy horizon and sets it where morning will find it squared. In the village, the tomb worker leans his reed against the wall, dots the last figure in the ration tally, and smiles at the sound a full jar makes when you set it down on reed matting. The architect closes the wooden case on the plumb bob as if tucking in a small, accurate animal. Somewhere in the necropolis, letters in gold pretend not to watch. A cat who disapproves of accuracy because it prefers improvisation yawns and forgives everyone. If sleep is curling under your eyelids, you can let it. Think of the feather again, hardly anything, keeping everything balanced. Think of the neat oval holding a name so the future can find it without having to ask. Think of bread molds that do not argue, beer jars that stop precisely at the shoulder their potter intended, and the comfortable arithmetic of rations that add up to dinner. Think of stairs that translate water into planning, and of ropes that sing when straight. Think of seals on jars that carry whole committees in a thumbprint. Think of how a civilization that trusted small, boring rules stayed remarkably awake for more than 3,000 years, so that we, very comfortably drowsy now, can borrow one of their evenings and drift across it like a light boat after the oars are set down. And if a final microfact is needed as a pillow. The cubit itself was measured by the forearm, wrist to elbow, with a master rod to keep everyone's forearms from taking creative liberties. It is a measurement you can carry around on your own body, which is politely considerate of the universe. A worker touches the master, touches his arm, and the stone block suddenly knows what to be. Boredom with purpose, accuracy with a soft edge, the world made slightly clearer one line at a time. The feather settles, the rope hums, the numbers from the stair echo down the canal and decide tomorrow's lunch. The ink dries into tidy permanence. Nothing rushes. Everything finds its place. You may close your eyes whenever a sentence ends, or in the middle of one if the jar's shoulder suggests it, and the rules will keep working until morning.